Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to tell you about the work that we've been doing at the Mathematics, Reasoning, and Learning Lab right here at Rutgers University in Newark. So the title of my talk is Exploring the Brain Basis of Rational Number Processing. And you might be wondering, what can learning about this kind of wet, squishy biological organ of the brain tell us about the uniquely human process of learning mathematics? And to begin to answer that question, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how we measure the brain and what kind of information it can give us. And to do that, we're going to start with an activity. So I'm going to show you two sets of dots. Ordinarily, I'd ask you to call out the answer, but here, just think in your mind, which side is larger, the left or the right? Now that was presented really briefly, but you should have been able to tell that there were more dots on the left than on the right. Now we're going to do another one. Now that was probably a lot harder for you. And in fact, there were still more dots on the left and the right, but it was much harder to tell because the difference between them was much closer. Now I'm going to give you the same examples, but this time with numerals. Again, this one should be easy, whereas this one should be harder. And what's interesting is that in the first case, you can see that the number of dots is going to make it harder or easier to tell, but we seem to have the same effect when we're processing number symbols. And so from an experimental perspective, we can think of these kinds of stimuli which differ by 1 as being near on the number line, whereas these problems which differ by 6 are far apart on the number line. So let's keep this difference in mind as I tell you a little bit about how we study the brain. So you may have seen images like this, perhaps where we're sort of cutting through the brains of adults and children, and we've got these colorful blobs. Or we could have these kind of cool 3D rendered brains, again with these colorful blobs on them. And so how we get these is we do something called functional neuroimaging, and we use the same MRI machine that you might go to if you maybe injure your knee, but instead of measuring a knee, we have a child lie down in the scanner and we measure their brain. And we have this contraption around their head which helps us pick up the signals, but also has a mirror on it which is facing a projector behind the scanner that you can't see, which is showing math problems to the child while they're in the scanner. And so they might see problems just like the ones I just showed you. So for example, these easy problems with the far distance and these harder problems with the near distance. And while they're answering those problems, instead of calling out, they're using their index and middle finger to indicate the left or the right side of the screen. We don't want them talking and moving in the scanner because then the pictures are blurry. So while they're in the scanner, they're working hard, and it turns out that the harder an area of the brain is working, the more energy it needs. So neurons are firing, are sending electrical signals, and they're using energy. And to replenish their energy, the blood is sending them hemoglobin with oxygen on it. And it turns out that deoxygenated hemoglobin is slightly magnetic and has a lower magnetic signal than the neutral oxygenated hemoglobin, which has a higher signal. So with this MRI machine, which is the M is for magnetic, we're measuring the magnetic signal in different parts of the brain. And the parts of the brain that are working hardest are going to have elevated signal. And so we might get a signal out of the brain that looks like this. So in each location of the brain, we might see something like this. To be honest, this is much cleaner than the real data, but it'll be good enough for our purposes. And while we're getting the signal, the child is seeing these kinds of problems. And we might notice that for these harder problems, there are more activity than for the easier problems that differ by 1. And so with a little bit more complicated statistics, but in general what we do is kind of average together the signal for the hard task and the easy task. And so you might see something like this, where you've got greater activity for the hard task than the easy task, and we can turn this into a statistical test and color code the brain. So the bigger the difference between the hard and the easy task, the brighter the color is on the brain. And in our example, we could look at the difference between near and far problems. Now, when we study the brain, there are lots of areas that are involved, but today we're going to really be concentrating on this parietal region, which is involved in calculation and number processing. And so in the case of these distance effects that we just talked about, if we're showing people these non-symbolic stimuli and we show them to adults, we find greater activity in this parietal lobe region. We're looking at the brain cut through like this and up here. We're going to see greater activity in the region called the interparietal sulcus, which I'll use sometimes the term IPS, or the parietal lobe. And they're going to have greater activity for near than far problems. And if we give these same problems to kids, they're also going to show this pattern. So it suggests that this kind of difference between sets of dots is something that kids can do maybe innately. Even younger children show these effects. And now we can ask, well, what's happening in this part of the brain that processes non-symbolic magnitude for number symbols? And of course, number symbols are something that we have to learn. We learn them at home. We learn them in school. Nobody is born automatically knowing that, this squiggle is bigger than this squiggle. But if you show these symbols to adults in the same part of the brain, now we're looking at the brain cut through like this, we see greater activity for near than far problems. But if we show them to children, we don't see this activity. And so that tells us that it takes a lot of experience and practice with numbers to get the parietal lobe to show this sort of automatic coding of the magnitude, so working harder for near than far problems. And so we can say that with learning, the parietal lobe comes to respond to the magnitude of whole number symbols. Now we can finally turn to our key question, which is what makes rational numbers difficult to learn? And the big idea that sort of pushes our work forward is that rational numbers are difficult because our prior knowledge about whole numbers interferes with our learning about rationals. And so if we wanted to look for something to support this idea from the brain, we would want to see, well, where does the brain process rational numbers? We know that this parietal lobe area processes whole numbers, and so if there's interference, we might expect rational numbers to be processed there as well. And what happens in the brain when there's interference between whole and rational numbers, when the whole number is taking you one way and the rational number is taking you a different way? So to answer that first question, we did a little study where we just took the kinds of non-symbolic rational number representations, so things like pie charts and bar charts and maybe sets of dots, and we looked at studies that had used those stimuli. And I'm going to show you studies using these dots, lines, and pies overlaid on brain. So underneath here in orange are brain areas that are important for processing whole number non-symbolic stimuli. And there's dozens of studies, and so we get these nice blobs of activity, that's the technical term, going along our favorite area, this parietal lobe area. And we can see that in the few studies that have used these non-symbolic stimuli, you find activity in very similar areas. Now, what if we turn to symbolic stimuli? Well, here we can also see for fractions and decimals, again, whole number comparison tasks underneath, and on top of them in these colored circles and squares are areas for fractions and decimals. So this is telling us that when people are looking at fractions and decimals, they're using their parietal lobe. But we don't know if they're just processing the individual whole numbers or if they're really processing the magnitude of the rational number symbols that they're observing. So to do that, we developed a task that uses decimal comparison. So again, I'm going to have you think in your mind which side is larger, the left or the right. And so here's the stimulus. I'm going to leave it up because this is actually a pretty tricky question. And if you ask kids that, if you ask them, they might say that 0.36 is bigger than 0.9. And that's because, of course, they've learned that double-digit numbers are bigger than single-digit numbers. And if they don't really understand what the decimal point means, they might come to that conclusion. And the interesting thing is, if you ask adults this, they'll probably most of the time get the right answer, but it'll take them longer than if we gave them a question like 0.3 versus 0.96. And I'll tell you that we measure those. I'm not going to show you them today, and that's because the way that people solve them, they can just be using their whole number. We're looking for these places where your whole and rational are in conflict. So this is a pretty tough problem, but I'm going to make it even tougher on this next example. So here, again, the single digit is bigger than the double digit, but also these numbers are much closer together. These are a near comparison. And studies have shown that people also process the magnitude of rational numbers, and they're going to have greater activity for near than far problems in rational number space. So now I'm going to make this problem even harder. So now we're still 2.09 apart, but now if you were ignoring the decimal points, this might be an even harder problem because now you're comparing 9 to 81, and that's really pushing you towards the rational, towards the whole number response. So let's look at all of these stimuli together. So here are the comparisons. And if we think that people are just paying attention to the actual magnitude of these numbers, then this one's going to be a lot harder than this one because this one is a lot closer together. And now so this is going to be a near versus far in rational distance. But now let's add on this other one. So these are the same difficulty in terms of rational distance, but if you're ignoring that decimal point, 4 versus 31 is hard, but 9 versus 81 is even farther pushing you towards the wrong answer. And so in terms of whole distance when you're ignoring the decimal place, these ones are not too bad, but this one is really hard. And so here we might expect that the far problems, because they're far in whole distance, are going to be the hardest. Now, if people are just processing, if just thinking about the rational number, then these two problems should not be differing in difficulty. So what do we see in behavior? Well, indeed, people make more errors on these near versus far problems in rational distance, and they tend to be slower on them than for the far problems. However, when we turn to whole distance, now we're finding that the far problems are twice as difficult as the near problems. And interestingly, when we look at their reaction times, we're only actually looking at their correct trials, and we don't see any difference between them. And that tells us that if they're getting the answer right, it's almost as if they have to learn to ignore the whole number distance in order to get that right. Now, what do we see in the brain? So in our favorite parietal region, we're going to see we see what we expect to see, which is that there's greater activity for near than far problems on both the left and the right parietal lobe. And if we turn to whole distance, we actually see this weird effect, but the one we expect, which is that there's greater activity for far than near problems. So people are working harder when the whole number information is pushing them in the wrong direction. And these lines are the individual participants, and almost every single one of them is showing this effect of working harder. So to come back to our big questions, where does the brain process rational numbers? It's processing them in those same regions that are used for whole numbers. And What happens when there's interference? The parietal lobe is working harder when there's more interference from the whole numbers, when whole number knowledge contradicts rational numbers. So together, this tells us that adults are processing whole number interference. And it leads to a bunch of really interesting next questions. How does rational number patterns change with learning? So this is what adults are doing. What are kids doing? Kids might not even notice that there's a interference here, and they might just be processing them as whole numbers, getting it wrong and showing the opposite effects. And so we're interested in seeing how those change with just regular schooling. But what we're really interested in is what is the effect of instruction, and can we change those brain patterns? So we could think about two different kinds of instructions. One which maybe just removes the interference, like if you added a 0 in your mind onto the single digit single digit number, you might then sort of remove that interference. Or you might want to think about those numbers in terms of their magnitude. And so in both of these instructions, you might get better at the task behaviorally. But we could use brain imaging to say, well, does your whole number interference effect go down? And does your rational number magnitude effect go up? And that could be a place where we could see that brain data tells us something that the behavioral data cannot. And then, of course, the key question is, well, which kind of instruction is going to most help people get to that mature pattern of brain activity? And we saw that non-symbolic stimuli are also processed in these parietal lobe regions. And I told you that for whole numbers, we're sort of learning to make a mapping between that symbol 8 and that magnitude 8. And so we would love to see if instructing people to make a mapping between a representation of a half and the number symbol 1/2 or 0.5 improves people's performance on these kinds of tasks and in later kinds of working with rational numbers. And so we can think about what is the effect of non-symbolic proportional reasoning on brain activity patterns and then future learning. So I'll end here by thanking my co-presenters and other people in the lab who worked on these projects, and of course the participants for sharing their brains with us. Thank you.